So what causes homelessness? Everybody probably has like some stereotype that they think drives it. For example, a person who becomes an addict, loses all their friends and family, doesn't pay their bills and puts all their money towards their drugs and eventually is, more or less bankrupt and they wind up on the street. And that is a portion of the people who do experience homelessness, but a fairly small portion. I mean, there's plenty of other people, and I'll explain in a minute what I mean by that. But as far as like another typical stereotype is a person who has mental illness. And the first thing that might come to mind is maybe a person who has schizophrenia, right? They're kind of out of touch with reality. And, as a result, they can't, maintain employment. They have problems paying the bills and so on. And they're just kind of difficult to be around. So, that's also potentially a driver, and it is. But also what we consider mental illness is maybe broader than that. For example, what if a person who is basically angry, a very belligerent person, kind of a bully? That type of personality would also be hard to employ because they're difficult and they don't get along with other workers and they cause issues at work. And also just living with them. So not only, do they not have the ability to, be in a relationship where they could like share the cost with someone, but maybe any type of communal housing, even an apartment complex, right? If a person is really difficult, they might get evicted because they're constantly causing problems with their neighbors. And those are just, probably two or three of the most common ones that people think about, but there are many other things to consider. For example, let's say a person who gets sick and they have medical debt associated with that. At some point, maybe the deductibles and the co-pays, they, inundate the person and the person gets overwhelmed by the medical debt and basically has no money to pay their rent. So they have to decide, well, do I want to continue to live because I have this medical illness, or do I want to, have a place to stay? Stuff like that. There is also the typical that we kind of think about, maybe a person who's gambling, right? They throw away all their money, they don't have anything left over for their living expenses, and eventually they get evicted or are thrown out. Also kind of in line with that, a person who's extended unemployment. Certainly technology changes from year to year. Maybe a person's been working with a company for a couple of decades and they have a good position, but it's kind of an old world, Maybe they manufacture, horse and buggies, and now cars are here and they're like, okay, I had this great job for a while, but not making that product anymore. And I don't have new skills I can't adapt to what's next. There's also people who don't plan properly. For example, we all kind of figure that one day we're going to retire, but that requires us to build up a nest egg. And hopefully we're going to have some Social Security, but that may not be enough to cover all our expenses. In which case, a person might, be retired and last for 5 or 10 years. They've run out of the small nest egg that they had, and eventually they're unable to meet the payments that they need to make for utilities and food as well as their rent. There's other things. For example, a person who has been in jail for a while. They are eventually released and they're a felon, so it's really hard for them to find work. Perhaps during their criminal activity, they alienated their friends and family and they don't have a place to go to, even if it's just to tide them over until they're able to find employment and turn their lives around. There's, of course, this general fiscal irresponsibility. Maybe a person who builds up a ton of credit card debt, keeps getting new credit cards, and eventually it becomes overwhelming and it bankrupts them. And there's other things, like kind of along the illness, but an incapacitation of sorts, right? Maybe you're a person who, uses your hands and your arms all the time, and you have an accident, a car accident, where you lose the use of one of your arms. Now all of a sudden you can't type, or it becomes really difficult to type. So if you had a job that was related to that, it might be really difficult for you to maintain employment. Kind of the point that I'm trying to make here is that there are a variety of factors that drive homelessness. And homelessness is not always what you necessarily think it is. Meaning that, yes, there are people who live on the street and we know that they're experiencing homelessness, right? They're camping on the sidewalk every night. However, the majority of people are actually sheltered, and they might be actually like couch surfing, staying with family and friends for a period of time, and just living here and there. And while they, aren't necessarily homeless per se, where they have a place to stay, it's not something that they're guaranteed. It's not like situated for them. They're not paying rent. They're not contributing to the running of the house or anything like that. And you are kind of beholden to someone else. And that's kind of a key thing, because there is this really, kind of like safety net, this natural safety net out there of other people that take care of us when times get tough. I had an extra room in my house when I was raising my kids, and I would give it to people for periods of anywhere from like 3 or 4 months to a year. And it would enable them to transition to, maybe save some money so they weren't living month to month, maybe to get some new skills, or maybe just to find a job because they lost their work. And in some instances, they were ending a relationship. And that's kind of maybe the last issue that we should talk about, is that sometimes you're in a tough relationship and you're beholden to them for paying the rent. And you choose, well, this is kind of a difficult relationship. It's really harming me from a mental and emotional standpoint. I need to get out of it, but I don't have the ability to find a new place. What are my options? Well, going homeless could be one of them. And kind of in line with that is also a person who's fleeing abuse. So that could be anything from a child who is being abused by a parent or a close relative that lives with them, and potentially a partner, right? There are plenty of stories of women that flee their partners and potentially also have kids at the time, and the whole family actually has to flee because it's just that difficult, if not dangerous, living at home with this person. So keep in mind, there are a variety of things that drive homelessness, maybe not just the one or two standard things that we kind of stereotype with that. And the other thing I would like to recommend is that, or talk about, is the fact that there is a large behavior, theme that kind of goes with all these things. People talk about affordable housing. And all of the cases that I talked about, it's not really about a person has some money, but they don't have enough, and they lose their apartment or something like that. And most of these cases, they did something fiscally, or maybe it's the behavior of someone, like when fleeing abuse. But behavior, their own personal behavior or someone else's behavior, drove their being homeless. And that's kind of a key thing, because in my estimation, again, if we're going to fix this problem, if we're going to end homelessness, we need to consider the behavioral wellness. And not just of course, the people who are experiencing homelessness or those who might have pushed them into it, but also the greater community around them. Why are we not able to help these people? Why are we not able to give them these transition options? And why do we enable people or kind of allow them to get in these problems in the first place, right? Shouldn't we have better gambling restrictions or ensure that people are preparing for retirement and stuff like that? Anyway, many causes, and ultimately behavioral wellness, changing everyone's behavioral wellness, improving it, will go a long way in ending homelessness.